Hello and welcome to another episode of I Miss Book Club. I'm your host, Veronica Reynolds, Head of Community Relations at New City Library, and I'm joined again once again today with my co-host, Brian Jennings, Head of Adult Services here at New City Library Express. Welcome, Brian.
Hello, Veronica. Thanks for having me today.
So we have a slightly different topic today. I suppose we have a slightly different topic almost every episode, but today is a really interesting long-term project that Brian's been working on that we want to share with you and give you the tools to do at home. And that's taking oral history from your friends and loved ones so that the smaller stories of lives around you aren't lost to time.
Yeah, Veronica, since I've been in New City Library, we've collected over 100 stories from local residents. Started as a grant from the Library Association, Rockland County. The Ramapo-Catskill Library System also gave us money towards this, and we received an award for the Share, Listen, and Learn program, which was a series of listening programs where we invited the public to come and listen to their friends and neighbors talk about different aspects of their lives. And we would clip out short clips where they talked about things like going to school, working, stories from veterans, a whole variety of different aspects of people's lives. And so that's what I thought we'd talk a little bit about today, is how we conduct those interviews in case people at home were interested in doing this sort of thing themselves. Everybody has a story, and it's great to collect those things for posterity.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're curious about any of the clips you hear today, we do have a whole section on our website, newcitylibrary.org, on the oral histories with links to our SoundCloud, where they're all recorded. And just to emphasize how important it was, while I was looking for that link, I was reading through the list, and I can see that sadly several of the people on that list who I knew have since passed. And that's just in the few short years that we've been doing it. So those preservation of their stories is even more critical, because otherwise they would be lost.
Yeah, even in preparing for this and looking, there are people that passed away that I didn't even know had passed. So, get those interviews down and get those people on the record if they're in your family, so you can save some of those stories.
So I guess the first question, Brian, is how do you even start an interview?
So for us, when we start an interview, we always want to identify ourselves, the interviewer. And I had a whole crew of volunteers that were trained. So some of the interviews are interviews that I conducted. Some are interviews that my volunteers conducted. And we also received a grant to have Eileen McAdam from the Sound and Story Project of the Hudson Valley do interviews. And she kind of got the ball rolling for us, and has been, kind of a mentor in this for me. So you always want to start and say, today is November 30th, 2022. And my name's Brian Jennings. I'm here at the New City Library in New City, New York. And today I'm going to have a conversation with whoever it is you're interviewing. I also always, before I start the interview, I'll say to the person, I want you to introduce yourself and tell us when and where you were born, if you don't mind. Some people don't want to say exactly where they were or when they were born. But I kind of prepare people before that ahead of time. I think there's something very powerful about someone saying, this is me, this is who I am, and this is where I'm from. And so when we get the audio back, one of the first things we do is we clip out that little front portion where the person introduces themselves. And then any stories that later come, we have that first part where they introduce themselves, and then we add that on the story, and that becomes our clip. So I thought today, the funny thing is, when people introduce themselves, sometimes they just say, "I'm Brian Jennings. I was born, 1975 in McKeesport, Pennsylvania." But sometimes people will give you a little more information right off the start. And the first one I want to play for you is with Rita DiCarlo. And unfortunately, as we talked about, in researching this, I didn't realize it, but Rita passed. She made 100 years. And I think she was very proud of that, getting to that 100-year.
She should be. That's an accomplishment.
Marker. And but she passed soon after that. But here she is.
Well, I'm Rita Elizabeth Martello. Eventually, I married and became DiCarlo. But I was born May 31st, 1922. And there's a little question about when I was born because the doctor was called at the last minute when my mother was in labor. And I think it was nearer to 12 o'clock. So when he registered my birth, he registered it June 4th as June 1, 1922. However, my grandfather, who was a scholar, had a diary. And in his diary, Grandpa Bosico wrote, Mama, by her name, Concetta, and Vincenzo, her husband, today, Mercoledì, May 31, 1922, had a baby girl, Rita, and that was me. So I have 2 birthdays. So next week, I'll be 95, May 31st.
So that was Rita, about the confusion on when she was born.
Which is, I suppose, pretty common from the time. I mean, we have lots of people, we don't know their birthdays, right?
Right. But that was a great interview. Talked all about growing up in Haverstraw, down by the river. And, I remember she told me a story about how it was really cold and they would warm up the bricks in the oven, I guess, or, and then they would wrap the brick in cloth and put it in the bed. And she slept with her sister because I guess they had so many kids, not enough room.
Right.
And one day she didn't bring her brick, warm it up, and she put her feet over. You put your feet on the brick, and her sister says, "Get your feet off my brick." Lots of good stories there. Another one here I'm going to play also talks about the doctor and and where they were born. This is Gordon Wren Jr.
My name is Gordon Wren Jr. I was born in Good Samaritan Hospital. I was born in 1947 in the hospital. Dr. Henry Kaplan was our attending physician.
So a lot of times people will say what hospital they were born in. But Gordon also listed the attending physician, which is not common.
That's some memory.
To do that. Probably, I imagine, there weren't that many physicians. If you were born in Good Sam, probably during that time, maybe 9 out of 10, he was the attending physician for you. And, small town, probably could have even been a family friend.
Right.
But when I do interviews, really what they are is their kind of life histories. So we really do kind of chronologically, tell me a little bit about where you were born. Or what are your earliest memories of growing up, wherever it is they grew up, whether or not it is in Rockland. Or tell me, a fond memory that you have. So that's kind of how we progress.
Right. So you start with kind of a childhood memory and bring them up through the years.
Right.
Okay.
And probably one of the better interviews that was collected by Eileen McAdam as part of our original series of interviews. And we brought this big cube.
Yeah, I was going to say, you got to talk about the cube.
We brought this big cube into the library, which is partly a recording studio in a sense, because it was kind of soundproof, but it's also kind of like a public art sculpture Very
Yes,
strange.
just to emphasize, it is really a giant mirrored cube that was in our
giant
room.
mirrored cube. And you'll hear from the audio here that this is a much clearer piece because it was recorded in there. Eileen also has some really top-notch equipment. But here's Walter Luther talking about growing up, but he experienced this kind of way of life that extends back into old Rockland County of these kind of small subsistence farmers because he would visit his grandfather, and here he is. I just love this clip.
My name is Walter J. Luther. I spent most of my summers at my grandfather's, which was in Sandy Fields in Harriman State Park. I enjoyed that immensely. It was wild and free. My grandfather was fascinating to me. He raised farm animals, chickens, pigs, horses, cows. At the time, the only modern service they had at my grandfather's farm was telephone service. There was no electricity. In the winter, I would sleep upstairs near the roof. I remember in the colder weather, late October, early November, waking up in the morning and looking up at the roof and seeing the nails coming through the roof, and, frost balls on the end of them, so you knew it was cold outside. Facilities were an outhouse. That was, when you needed it, it was there. He was really a subsistence farmer and very proud of the fact that he never used any store-bought or what he called patent food for his animals. Everything was raised and grown right there on the farm. They had an ice box in the basement. He used that to keep milk and cheese cool. I was amazed at my mom growing up there. She carried water as a young girl, probably almost 500 feet from the spring to the house because they had no well at the time. Wash day and things like that, Grandpa would hook up the team and put barrels in the wagon and bring barrels of water to the house for wash day. Drinking water was mostly carried by the girls. Going to the barn with my grandfather when I was 10 in the evening by kerosene light was an experience I'll never forget. The smells in the barn, they get in your blood and they stay with you all your life.
So really interesting. Just so much emotion is evoked in his voice, and it just extends us back into a time that none of us, these days at least, maybe there's a few old timers that remember the farms, but
Right.
no electricity. I mean, that's really, really kind of a unique thing. And Walter lives in Congers now, a great guy. He's the president of the Historical Society of the Palisades Interstate Park Region, which is a group that's devoted to preserving the stories and memories of and history of the kind of lost villages inside Harriman, Doodletown.
Yeah, because I think it's worth noting no one lives in Harriman anymore.
Right. So I think his grandfather lived there to the early 60s, and then he had a health issue. Apparently they had to medevac him out.
Oof.
They're like, well, okay, that's enough of that.
Right.
But Walter was lucky enough to get those experiences as a boy.
And we've done some hikes up to that area. You can see the remains of Doodletown and some of those other locations.
I actually went on a hike with the Historical Society with Walter.
Oh, there you go.
Gordon Wren Jr., who was before, also his family had some connection going back in there somehow. And those two guys took us in there, and it was a site, I think Joe Barbieri did a hike with a guy, and they went into the site where the old Conklin cabin was. So Ramsey Conklin was another one of these kind of last people to live in the park sort of a thing, but certainly earlier than the time Walter was talking about.
Kind of talking about childhood that definitely intimately connects to parents and grandparents, which I think is so critical, because talk about lost memories. When you're already talking to somebody who's in the latter years of their life, stories about their parents and grandparents are an endangered species. This might be the only preservation we have of that generation sometimes, or just oral histories.
Now, generally speaking, oral history, you want to know first person stuff. I experienced this, but I think it's so important, like you said, to ask people about their memories, specifically of their parents and grandparents. And so we have a few of those. The first one I'm going to play is with Veronica Dwyer.
My name is Veronica Dwyer, and I was born in Gardenville, New York, March 31st, 1927. It was a small country town prior to the Tappan Zee Bridge, very countrified. There was a field across from the house I lived in, and it had I remember a cow being there. It was all farmland. It was a nice country town. My grandparents lived there. I remember being able to walk to my grandmother's house. Their wedding anniversary was July 4th, and the whole family would come to their house on July 4th and have a picnic. And in the evening, the men would shoot off fireworks. My grandmother was sort of a midwife. In fact, she delivered me, and she would be the one to go when anyone was sick. She wasn't a nurse, but she'd be there to help them. It was a typical small country town from years ago where everybody helped everybody else. During the Depression, there were so many men out of work, and they'd be walking and they'd come to your house and they'd say, "Can you give me something to eat?" And my mother would always make a dish of food and not let them in the house, but let them sit on the porch. But that was a common thing. Today you wouldn't do that, but then you knew it was just a man out of work who needed food. People were always willing to share. My grandmother lived in a factory house. It had a total of 3 bedrooms, and at the time there was 4 of my aunts and my uncle and my grandmother and grandfather in this house. And they're like townhouses side by side. And the person living next door to them, the father was killed in a railroad accident. So during the time of the funeral, my grandmother took in the little girl rather than have her exposed to all the sorrow that was going on. She lived there until she got married, which was long after my grandmother died. Her mother never took her back, and my grandmother just raised her. And she had nothing herself, but she took her in. So, she was quite a lady. My father would go every Sunday, if weather permitting, and we would go for a ride in the car with her because my grandfather didn't have a car. And we'd go up to the 7 lakes that are nearby or just ride around. And one thing about my grandmother, she always had time for me. She didn't have a microwave or a washing machine. She was an old-fashioned lady. She never bought a loaf of bread. She baked her own bread. And I could walk in the house. She'd stop everything and sit down with me. And I still remember that. And she was actually born and grew up in what is now Lake Welch, which was then Sandy Fields. And the Palisades and the State Parkway decided to take all that land and turn it into parkland. They flooded it and made it Lake Welch. But that is where my grandmother grew up.
Now, we just happened to get that interview with Veronica. Veronica is just someone who walked into the library. And one of our colleagues, you remember Andrew, knew I was doing the project, and he said, "You might want to interview this lady." And it's turned out to be an excellent interview with her. And that little section talking about her grandmother and
what a nice slice of life moment to have preserved. I think that statement of like, my grandmother always had time for me, even when she didn't have anything else, is like just a small moment of profundity. Really beautiful thing to have on tape. And
she lives in Congers now, as does Walter Luther. Another one, I have this whole collection, or let's say several interviews with people who grew up in, say, Piermont, Spark Hill area, but now a couple of them live in New City. And this gentleman, quiet guy, I used to see him come in, read the paper. I didn't know who he was. or anything about him, but was introduced to him by some other people I had interviewed, and his name is Bruno Cosentino.
I was born in Piermont in 1932. My father was Frank. He was an immigrant, came from Italy at 17 years of age, couldn't speak the language, but he was the oldest child in his family, and the hope was in those days if you could send somebody to the United States. He didn't believe the roads were paved with gold, as some people thought, but it was opportunity. I remember that his father, they didn't have a lot of money, but I think he was better off than some of the kids in the community, the town he grew up in, St. Andrea, Italy. But he had an olive farm, olive trees. And they used to call him, I was named after my grandfather. They called him Bruno de l'Olive. Bruno of the Olives, I guess that means. And they were, by my standards, I would say poor. He said they never had meat, except maybe on holidays. He ate a lot of spaghetti, naturally. The reason he left Italy was to come over here and make a living, have it better than they could have it in Italy. They had a network of paisans, I call them, the countrymen who preceded him. They helped each other out. And I don't know how they networked, because they didn't see each other. They didn't have cars, they didn't have phones, but they always seemed to know where there was work. And they'd always tell him, this place is hiring. He was lettering suitcases in Philadelphia, just, as you initial them. But then somebody said to him, there's a paper factory in Piermont, Robert Gere. That's what it was called then. And they're hiring. So sure enough, my father got the job. He worked there for about 40 years, 37, 40. He died on the job, as a matter of fact. He collapsed on the floor. But he worked there, my mother worked there too, and I worked my way through college there. Robert Gere's was very good to the community of Piermont, because you either worked in Robert Gere's, Erdl Italy, or Orange and Rockland. Those are the three places for employment.
So Bruno also gets into a little bit of the working aspect, and we have some great stories about Robert Gere, Paper Factory. Joe DiNocenzo is another one. I don't have a clip we're going to play here, but he's the other. You
can find these all on the website.
Yeah.
I'm curious about hearing more from any individual or just listening to some of the random ones that we have up there.
Bruno was the first principal of Laurel Plains Elementary School. And, anyway, we'll get back to him later. Here's another one. It's Kiki Fullmer talking about her grandmother.
My name is Catherine Morton Fullmer, better known as Kiki, and I was born in Nyack Hospital in Nyack. My grandmother's name was Caroline Lexo Babcock. She was born in 1882. So in many ways, I remember her as a very correct, very proper Victorian. However, her ideas and the things that she would challenge us with were not Victorian ideas. They were very much of the 50s and 60s and 70s, when I would be talking to her about politics, because you couldn't talk to grandmother and not talk about politics and literature. That was it. I don't know how she managed to have tea parties with me, but she did. But politics and literature. She wanted me to talk about my dolls, but I didn't do dolls. I called grandmother my hippie grandmother because she was a suffragist. She was a suffragist right out of college and stayed a suffragist for years and years and years and years and years, all the way up past getting the vote. She had also become a pacifist in 1898 and was a pacifist all of her life, and actually felt that was closer to her heart than suffrage. She also supported African American rights, civil rights, Native American civil rights. She was a vegetarian, belonged to a number of animal rights organizations. I don't think you could hit a particular philosophy and she not have had an opinion, certainly, and it would have been on the radical side, I think. But New York was certainly a pivotal state concerning suffrage. When it passed in 1917, started the domino effect to get the other big states, Wisconsin and New York, and I forget what the third one was. And it's always important to look back and see what a struggle is like. It certainly gave me perspective during the ERA campaign. Grandmother had worked for the Equal Rights Amendment with Alice Paul, and I felt that she had turned the torch over to me. Actually, Grandmother belonged to NOW, the National Organization for Women, before I did. I got dragged to my first meeting in 1977, and I don't know if you know these types of organizations, but I was immediately made chair of the Equal Rights campaign.
So we interviewed her right around the time we were celebrating women's suffrage, 100 years in New York State, and women's suffrage nationally, the centennial of that. So
it's incredible because, it feels like a historical event, but when you realize how close it is, I think that's one of the power of these interviews is how immediate it really is to us.
Yeah. When you think about like my grandmother, when she was born, her mother didn't have the right to vote. But you go back a generation, you're really reaching into these stories that focus directly on those struggles.
I was thinking of that phrase, we say, oh, it's in living memory. And there's people alive who just remember their parents going through a struggle like this. It's just not that far from us.
Not far at all. Another thing that I like to ask people about is going to school, potentially what teachers may have influenced them. I love Felix Festa's stories. I actually met his daughter-in-law in the library the other day, and we were talking. And I said, I always remember this story. And it's a story by Corinne McGeorge, who lives in Haverstraw, but grew up in Congers.
I was born in New York City. I was born in the Bronx, February 2nd, 1928.
Where did you go to school?
Congers had its elementary school and its high school. And the high school served an area larger than just Congers. We would have Valley Cottage, West Nyack, so forth. And those kids would come up on what we call the school train. So we would be waiting there in the library at school, looking out the window, waiting for the kids to come up on the school train because school couldn't start until they came. They represented a sizable chunk of the student body.
What else do you remember about school? Any teachers?
Oh, school was a wonderful memory. I loved every minute of it. Felix Festa, whom they named the school after in Clarkstown, he was my principal. Felix Festa was my principal, and his brother Vincent Festa was my math teacher. And we loved the both of them. And Vincent Festa, if he thought you were nodding off or falling asleep, he'd throw erasers at you. But I can remember Felix Festa. I had one particular memory of him. I was having trouble with math. It was the solid geometry. I couldn't understand that thing for beans. I wanted to drop it. The teacher said I couldn't drop it. She sent me down to the principal's office. I tried to explain to him I cannot learn this. We sat all afternoon at the principal's desk while he tutored me in solid geometry. He would not let me drop it. He said, I want you to understand it because you can understand this. He was such a wonderful man. Wonderful.
The story also about the train is very interesting because you hear so many stories from people about taking the train to go to school. I could probably do a whole segment just on people who took a train to go to school. But it gets back to that kind of small town, little school feel. And another one we have, this interview was actually conducted by Bob Goldberg, who interviewed quite a few people with Gene Brown, who grew up in Upper Nyack. As far as I know, he still lives there.
I was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1927, but my father came here to Upper Nyack just 4 months later. I went to the old original Upper Nyack School on a street that is still called School Street, but it now has houses all around it. School's gone. The classes went 8 grades, and each room had 1 or sometimes 2 grades. In other words, I believe the 5th and 6th grade were in one room, and the 7th and 8th grade were in one room. I remember Esther Rose. Esther Rose lived in Haverstraw, but she was one of the few teachers that traveled any distance, came 8 or 10 miles by car. She was very strict, but after we graduated, she kept in touch with many of the students. I watched us go through high school and on to college. One wonderful thing at the old Upper Nyack School was the commencement, the 8th grade commencement. Helen Hayes, the great lady of the theater at that time, lived just a 10-minute walk away from the school. And the 8th grade class made a point of inviting her to the commencement. And all the 8 years that I was at the school, she was invited, and about half of those years she was able to come, and she came to my 8th grade commencement, and it was a wonderful occasion for us. I remember there was an art prize, and it was awarded to me, and she gave the prize out. So I had a little art prize. I don't know what the prize was, but Helen Hayes gave it to me.
That story is interesting. One, he touches on these kind of small schools where you may have 2 grades in one room, almost a little schoolhouse sort of a thing. And then a lot of old timers talk about Helen Hayes, especially if they were anywhere in the area near Nyack.
Sure. I mean, she was kind of the local patroness for a lot of things.
Yeah, her influence was wide in the county. Now, one more school story, and this one was conducted by an intern that we had from Rockland Community College, Aratzi Cruz Gutierrez, and she's bilingual. And I had her conduct a series of interviews with immigrants from Spanish-speaking countries. This clip is with Ilana Eckert, who was the former superintendent of schools in North Rockland, about a very different sort of a starting school story.
Hi, I'm Ilana Eckert. I'm the superintendent of schools here in North Rockland, and I was born in Havana, Cuba in 1957. I left Cuba when I was 9, so I actually started my elementary school years in Cuba and attended school there through 3rd grade. And we left Cuba in 1966 in September, so I arrived here September 1966. And should have been starting my 4th grade year here. However, the thought, I guess, at that time was that since I had completed 3rd grade and didn't know English, repeating 3rd grade may be an easier thing to do. So actually, although I had great grades coming out of Cuba in 3rd grade, I was put in 3rd grade again when I arrived in school. And my first school was in Manhattan. And Washington Heights, actually. And I started 3rd grade, and I remember being very upset because I couldn't understand why I was being retained, which was such a horrible thing when I had good grades in school, and I always loved school. So that was the first, I guess, difficulty, was dealing with the fact that I was repeating a grade that I had been successful in. And I went to school, and one quick story about starting school in Manhattan. My mother dropped me off at the school after I was registered, dropped me off the first day that I was attending school, and children went in through the front door at the beginning of the day, so that's where she dropped me off. At the end of the day, though, however, we were dismissed through a back door in the school, and my mom was waiting in the front of the school, and after a while, she started seeing a lot of kids and didn't see me, and I was, of course, in the back of the school as we were dismissed through a different door, and at one point, both of us were crying. I was crying because I didn't find anybody that I knew, and I didn't know how to get home, and my mom was crying because I wasn't coming out of the school. So, as a teacher, having been a bilingual teacher for many years, I was very sensitive always when we had new students in the school to ask the parents if the children knew how to get home, if somebody was picking them up. I made sure that the kids and the parents knew where to connect, because that was a very scary experience.
So we have we have a number of interviews with educators, but you could really see how her personal experience informed her work later in schools. And another interesting thing about those interviews that we collected, that interview was done in English primarily, but she conducted some of the interviews in Spanish and then translated them into English. So transcribed them in Spanish and translated those transcriptions into English. And all of those interviews are online. I think there's either 4 or 5 of them. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but one of them was done with Andres.
I saw that. It's actually, because it's in alphabetical order on the website, he's the first one.
Abreu.
Yeah. Andres is a longtime custodian at our library, and I'm sure he had great stories.
Yeah. The next few clips that I want to talk about are about working. So really, I'm looking for things that are common to all of us, things that we can relate to. And this is almost kind of like a parent story as well, but it's an immigrant story, and it's also a story about, what parents want for their kids. A great interview with longtime resident who's now passed, Harry Waitsman.
I'm Harry Waitsman. I was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1927, and I came up to Rockland County with my family in 1935. My father had a fish store. It's called the Capitol. The Capitol was the place to go for fresh fish and for fresh everything. I would work there on the holidays, Jewish holidays. I was only 7 years old at that time, so I'd go down and help him take cash on the Jewish holidays, but he wanted me to get my education, and I was required to go to school and do well, and I did well. He kept the clams and the oysters outside of the market itself. He got friendly with the firemen, and they liked clams and stuff. He kept them in sacks, kept them on the sidewalk in the front of the fish store, not inside the fish store. And you learn, you don't put your hand in a sack if you don't know what's inside the sack, because they bought eels. And eels were like snakes. I mean, they really cut your hand very, very badly. But he had all of those things for sale, and I was there. It was interesting how he did things smart. I wanted to be a fisherman like my father. And he told me, you're not going to become a fisherman, you're going to become a doctor lawyer. And he put the two words together, a doctor lawyer. He didn't read or write English, but he could write Yiddish. I didn't realize that was so important. He did read and write, but not the language of the people who we lived in. We were all just hanging on, I guess, waiting for prosperity to come. It finally came.
I'll never forget Harry, after he told me a story during the interview. He said it's a great story, mostly true.
Sounds about right. He was a poet. He was actually the first Clarkstown Poet Laureate.
Yeah, I was lucky to get that interview. I think he passed not too long after I interviewed him. And there's a lot of good stories in there. He talks more about his father and coming here and from Poland, I believe.
He was a good storyteller.
Yeah, very good storyteller. Another good storyteller is Art Gunther, who was a longtime editor at the Journal News. There's another one collected by Bob Goldberg, who he sought out a lot of people who worked at the Journal News, because people who, worked in the local newspaper, they knew local stories and they were connected with local things. And this is one of the interviews he collected with Mr. Gunther.
My name is Arthur Henry Gunther III. I'm third generation Rocklander, born in Rockland County. And I grew up principally in Spring Valley, though I lived in Sloatsburg and Nanuet, Pearl River, Tallman, and Hillcrest. I was going to Hunter, and I needed gas money, to tell you the truth, so I needed a job where I could put a few hours in before I went to school. So I answered a blind ad for an office worker at 4 a.m., reply box number such and such, at care of the Journal News. I did not know it was for the Journal News. I just knew the hours were good, office work was good, and it turned out to be a copy boy position. That was 1964, and in those days in newspapering, you didn't necessarily have to walk in with a college degree or today as required a master's degree in journalism. You could learn on the job. And in the middle of the city room, there was a wire basket. And anybody, copy boy or anyone working for the company, typesetter, if they wanted to do a story or take a photo, and do both, they could do it, throw it in the basket. If the editor liked what you wrote or the picture that you took, it ran in the newspaper. So I started doing that, this enterprise work. And then it was noticed, and I was offered a full-time job as a photographer. I did that for 6 years. I continued to write on and off for the paper there. In those days, I preferred to take pictures. I did not like general reporting, kind of shy, probably, and that's the reason why I was never a very good reporter. But I ended up on the news desk and on the business desk, and eventually as night city editor, and then as assistant editorial page editor under the great Grant Jobson, and then I became the editorial page editor. In all, I was on the editorial page with Grant and by myself for about 32 years. It was a wonderful place to work because it was a small office and the camaraderie was strong, and people just liked putting out a newspaper. It wasn't officious. You didn't have to wear a tie, and it wasn't like an insurance office. It was a good place to learn, and I was the next to the last person who could move up from copy boy, which was an old tradition. Can't do that anymore.
A lot you can't do in journalism anymore.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's that kind of old idea of, you work your way up all the way from the bottom to the top.
I think about that all the time. Are there still mail rooms? Is that still a thing? You start in the mail room and become president of the company?
Right. That's sort of a thing. And Art has a ton of other great stories in there about going to school in Spring Valley and a ton of stuff in there. We also did a number of programs and interviewed quite a few veterans.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And the Library of Congress has a great kind of kit on their website, which it lists all these different questions that you would ask veterans. So usually when I interviewed a veteran, I would do some modified version of that interview. Because, if it was someone who grew up in Old Rockland, of course, I want to know where they grew up and I want to know about that sort of thing. But I would also then ask them things about where they did their basic training, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got our initial grant, we brought Eileen McAdam in. It was from the Library Association of Rockland County. They said, I said I would interview at least 2 people from each town in Rockland. And it was kind of like, well, who do you interview if you can only interview X amount of people? And so I kind of asked people that knew, and I kind of knew. And one of the people we got was Jerry Dunellen. another person who's passed.
Mm-hmm.
And he was so open and honest about his service and his life. Really one of the great interviews that we have. The clip I'm going to play here, and of course, this is someone who talks for a living,
right?
And an old Irish guy. So, some people are better at telling stories than others. And this clip is kind of a generalization of his thinking about veterans.
Okay.
Okay, my name is Jerry Donnellan, technically Gerald Thomas Patrick. I was born in Nyack in December 28th of 1946. I was working with veterans of all stripes from all wars, and it's funny in a way how similar they all are. I mean, the technology is different, the lexicon, but when you boil it down to the actual combat, I think the same guy was sitting there at Bunker Hill. It's just... it's an internal thing. It's something, not to be corny, but it's in the blood. And once you're touched by it, you're touched. And there's a commonality there, regardless of when and where. It's obviously styles and traditions and things are different. But when you boil it down to the least common denominator, they're all like, they all have the same sense of fear, the same sense of loyalty, the sense of brotherhood or sisterhood, or however you want to phrase it. Because when it all comes down to that, you're not fighting for God, mother, apple pie, or country. You're fighting for the person next to you to keep them alive.
So just a short little clip there. But it's really interesting to me to think about that. Because I think today I always think, hey, everyone is different. Every person is different. But I guess in a way, what Jerry is saying there, yeah, we're all different, but we're all the same.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least veterans are all the same. And I guess that's kind of what we're, when we, after having collected all these interviews and listened to them all, it's like we're all different, but we all are kind of the same. Everybody has to go to school. Everybody has to get a job.
Right.
And if you're a veteran, everyone has to go through basic training, and they kind of have these things instilled in them about their camaraderie.
One of the things I will often say, I do these like life of presentations on authors who are a couple hundred years old, and I always say humans are just going to human.
Right.
There's some moments where, I just did Jane Austen, and she was expressing distaste for something, and I was just like, it's such a human thing that we just all have these moments of irritability, of regret. There's just some mortal moments.
This next one deals with Camp Shanks. And it's with Mary Marshall. And I remember going to hear Ken Jackson, who was the DeWitt Clinton professor of, I think, New York history at Columbia University, literally wrote the book on New York history. And he was talking about the history of the Hudson Valley. And he said how he thought Camp Shanks, as an event, as a place, it was one of the most significant things to happen around here in Rockland. And if you don't know, it was a major embarkation point. It was in where Orangeburg is now. They have a marker over there, and they had a big camp, and soldiers would come there by train, and then they would go to the pier in Piermont, and a ship would come up, and that would take them. I don't know how many millions of soldiers passed through there. And it really impacted the local community.
My name is Mary Virion Marshall. I was born in Manhattan on November 18th, 1918. Well, we knew each other for years, and it was wartime, and the men went away to war for a while he was away for 4 years, but I wasn't going with him. I used to write to him because he wrote to me, but I wrote to other people too that were at war. It was after the war, when he came back, that we started going out together. During wartime, each town had a group of young girls that would go down to the manse barn in Tappan. That was a meeting place where the soldiers used to go in and play pool and table tennis, ping pong, I should say. It was run by the Salvation Army, and there was a lady from Congress that got a bunch of women together, and we would go down on the train to Tappan, get off the train and walk to the manse barn. And we would meet soldiers there and dance with them and talk to them and play ping pong and pool and things like that. And we had dances once a month. They would come into the camp, and from there they would be sent to an embarkation camp, where I think that's the word you used. From there they would go overseas to the war. So a lot of times you were the last person that you would see before they went to war.
So I just wanted to include that one because I think Shanks is so important historically to Rockland, and that story about going to dances and whatnot was kind of common story that you heard from others as well.
Yeah, I don't have any direct proof, but it just seems very likely that my grandfather was there. Just given the area he was living in, Brooklyn at the time, and he did ship out, so it's very likely he went through Camp Shanks.
Yeah, and they also had prisoners of war. They kept at Shanks. With another interview with a woman whose family owned. They seized the government seized land from people too. I mean, this was a huge thing. And then after the war, of course, there was a housing shortage because you have all these GIs coming back, starting families, and there aren't enough houses for all these new families. And of course, you have the baby boom, but they turned the barracks there. There's stories about that as well.
And I will say, as a modern twist, pretty recently there was a pretty big push for a nonprofit, and they've used some of Camp Shanks' land for underhomed veterans.
Oh yeah, that's
so there's now housing again.
Habitat for Humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Jerry and the Veterans organization was probably involved with that as well.
We had a talk at the library years ago now from the group, and at the time they had just started using the housing. I don't know how many they're up to now, but they had I think 24 people already moving in at the time, mostly Vietnam veterans, just by the time period now. But
yeah, that interview with Jerry though really sticks to me. So many things he said. He said he was walking around after the war, kind of not feeling so great. He said, nobody's doing anything for the veterans, like nobody's doing, in other words, the Vietnam veterans. Why is no one doing anything for the veterans? And he said, I had this friend who was the kind of friend who would tell you if you were, saying something stupid or doing something wrong. And he said, what are you doing? So it was kind of like, that was
good question.
That was the impetus for him then getting involved with Veterans Affairs. His friends say,
sure.
Hey, if you're so upset, what are you doing about it?
I think it's the beginning of a lot of things, is someone asking themselves, why isn't anyone doing anything? And then having to look at themselves and being like, well, I'm someone and I can do something.
So just listening to these things, personally, I feel like I've learned a lot. But kind of wrapping up, when you wrap up an interview, one of the things we'll ask is, do people remember events of historic significance, either on a national level or a local level? On a local level, people, have told us their stories about maybe the Brinks robbery.
Oh, yeah.
Or
And just a note about the Brinks robbery, if you're not familiar with it, we actually have original news footage about it up on our YouTube channel, so you can watch historical footage about it as well as get up-to-date information.
But a lot of people ultimately will talk about, the Kennedy assassination if they're of each generation has their own.
Oh yeah, my husband and I were just talking about the Challenger.
Oh
that
yeah,
was a big one for our generation.
I was in 5th grade.
Mm-hmm.
I think it might have been Miss Neuschwander's class.
Yeah, I mean it's
a
one
little
of those
fuzzy.
touchstones. I think we go to 9/11 because it was so traumatic.
Yeah.
But the Challenger, I mean, a lot of us watched it in school. They wheeled TVs out to show us. So certainly, I think a lot of us remembered it.
That's what I think. That's what I was about to say. Were we watching that live?
I think a lot of us were. I think we were in the cafeteria. I was younger, but my husband remembered watching it live because it was so exciting. It was supposed to be such a big event. Yeah.
So the clip I did of JFK is actually with Mr. or I should say Dr. Cosentino. He was the first principal at Laurel Plains Elementary, and he was the principal on the day of the Kennedy assassination and kind of had to deal with it. So we're just thinking about ourselves or our families when these things happen, but he had these kids and staff to deal with, and this was his memory of how he handled it.
I lived in Rockland County all my life. I was born in Piermont in 1932. I lived in Spark Hill and was fortunate enough to get a job in Clarkstown with the school district and purchased a house here. And I've been here now for over 60 years in Clarkstown. I'm not sure what, but all of a sudden popped into my head was the day that President JFK was assassinated. I was principal of Laurel Plains in 1963. And it happened around midday. The news came through. I was, we were all upset. I had a secretary who was very emotional. And she got running down the halls and was telling she wanted to get on the intercom. I said, no way. She wanted to call all the teachers, let them know. And I got angry with her. I said, you sit there and you keep quiet. I got 600 kids here. I'm not stirring this whole thing up. I don't know how the kids are going to react to it. When they go home, they'll find out. And when the teachers excuse the kids, you want to tell them, you can tell them. But this was like right after lunch hour or something, and she wanted to go running down the halls and telling everybody. And I said, absolutely not. That pops out as something of significance. An excellent, a good president. We lost him. And just the way I handled it, as far as, it wasn't my job to distribute the news. People would find out in their own time.
Now, the other thing that's interesting when you think about it is you could never do that today.
Oh, no. I mean, that news would
because the way information is disseminated, someone would have it on their phone and everyone would know.
It made me think of was the OJ verdict. I don't know if this was true at your school. I was in middle school, and they announced it over the speaker, over the PA system when the verdict came through.
I seem to remember, I remember watching The Chase after school, I feel like.
It interrupted a basketball game.
Oh.
So a lot of people watched it accidentally because they were watching a basketball game.
Yes, I was probably watching the basketball game. So.
But, they announced the verdict over the PA. I don't think that would happen now. That happened with, I think, Columbine too. I was in high school for Columbine. I think we found out. I don't think they announced it over the PA, but the news came through. And this is all pre-widespread internet. News just traveled in a different way, but we still got it pretty fast.
Yeah. So, and then at the end, of course, we would you always want to ask someone, do they have anything else they'd like to share? Because I like to emphasize to the people that I say, this is your interview. If there's anything you don't want to talk about, we don't have to talk about it. If there are things that you do want to talk about, this is their opportunity to kind of get any stories or things that they would like to add to the interview at the end.
Can I ask you, Brian, I'm thinking about data preservation. If people are doing this at home, like let's say with their own grandparents, what would you recommend? How many formats should they be saving it in? Should some of them be hard instead of all in the cloud? What do you think?
Well, there's kind of the old rule of three, having it three different ways. And that's funny you said, should you have it in a hard format? Well, when I started doing it, I would always make a copy of the interview on CD and send it to the individual. But the last few interviews I did, it was kind of like, well, does even anyone have a CD player anymore?
Right. Like that's the issue, right?
Kind of putting it in Google Drive in a folder, and then we share it. And then we also have it on our server. Originally we had that kind of hard format as well. But now, we upload them to New York Heritage, which is a statewide history portal. It has our postcard images, oral histories, old photographs. And I think that's nice too, because then you see images as well as these oral histories, and you see how those stories fill, how all the different history kind of fits together. The interesting thing about the stories is they kind of paint a picture in a way. And sometimes you learn about things that there just are no pictures of. Everybody of a certain age may take it for granted that they know that kids took trains to go to school. But how would you know that if you didn't ask?
So one of my favorite little stories, to go back far farther than we could do oral history on, is there is a city that's mentioned in hieroglyphics in Egypt. Our museum educator that we hire sometimes, Marissa Jaffe, Horowitz Jaffe, talks about this. City of Punt, I think it's called. And we have no idea where this city is, because in all of the writings, they're like, of course we know where Punt is. We're not going to write down where Punt is. Why would we bother? It's just assumed knowledge. And now all this time later, when we're trying to piece together the history, we have no idea where this city was. That was extremely important, and they traded with and had, diplomatic relations with. We have no idea where it is. And I think it's because they assumed at the time, of course, everybody knows this. Why should we have to state it?
Right.
So, things that we take for granted. And I was reading some online post talking about this, and someone responded, well, if you think about it, when we write down all our recipes, we just say eggs. 300 years from now, are they going to know we meant chicken eggs? Because we don't say chicken eggs, we just say eggs. Right? I mean, simple things like that get lost. So it's the more of this we can capture, the better, I think.
Yeah, we really, one of the things we want people to be specific. If they were talking to them and they're generalizing, you may say, well, give me an example. Or if they are telling a story and they kind of stop, then you say to them, well, what happened next? And that's always a good kind of follow up with people to get them going.
Yeah, and a great activity around the holidays when you have a relative in the house. Not everybody, but a lot of people want to talk about this stuff, or they may even not even realize they want to talk about it until they're asked. It's just a good moment in time to capture these things.
Yeah, if people know about StoryCorps, there's a good template. NPR StoryCorps has a good template if you're looking for a template for interviews. And if you're interested in, haven't done interviews since COVID. So my next thing is kind of exploring how I might use technology, things like we're doing now, to do more interviews.
Yeah,
because you really are in close contact with people. But I'm kind of itching to get back to more interviews. So if you know someone who you think would be a good interview, or you're interested in being involved with the project, certainly reach out to me and let me know.
You can always call the library at 845-634-4997, or you can go to our website to find all our email addresses at newcitylibrary.org under contact. Thank you, Brian, so much for this today. I am looking forward to seeing this episode go out. I think it's a helpful holiday episode for people looking for something to do with their relations, and maybe just even relive some beautiful memories together that you can capture for historical posterity.
Thanks for having me, Veronica.
All right. Thank you all so much for listening. And just remember, read on.